Notas, mihi, fecísti, This Sunday's communion chant, Notas, mihi, fecísti, shows up in several places in the liturgy. In the medieval liturgy, it was used during the third week of Lent, and it still appears there in our present liturgy. But if you don't sing chant, you won't get to hear it on a weekday in Lent. So it has been put here in the 31st week of the new calendar. These last weeks of the year in the old calendar were filled up by repeating some Mass settings that were used before Lent, or repeating some things that were used toward the end of the year. There wasn't much of a plan toward the end of the year. Our present calendar actually has some advantages in that way. We tend to stress more at this time of year the themes of death and judgment, eschatological themes of hope, of all saints, etc. And so to take this one from Lent and place it here is not entirely inappropriate. But as I say, this is a particularly good communion chant to be used at other times. And one of the options we have in the present liturgy is to substitute certain chants for other ones, or even, what is done most commonly, to substitute a hymn in place of the traditional chant. But if you are not able to learn a new communion every Sunday with your choir, but you want to do chant, it's quite possible to learn 4 or 5 communion chants and simply repeat them until you know them well enough. And this would certainly be one of them that would be good to know. It's particularly appropriate, and so on. Now, I want to explain a couple of things about our interpretation. You may notice we do things slightly differently in terms of tempo than what you might hear in a recording from the 1950s by the monks of Solem, or perhaps you've heard the monks of Samos sing their particular kind of chant. Again, these are recordings from the 50s and 60s. In the meantime, there's been some change in scholarship, and we are trying to reflect some of the new knowledge we have about the original notation. We're going to sing through the first half again, and I'm going to explain part of what we're doing. So, Notas, mihi, fecísti. Notas, mihi, fecísti. Now, the current notation that we use has its beginning in about the 13th or 14th century. And then the monks of Solem, the monastery where chant was revived in the 19th century, added on to this notation. And one of the things they added were symbols for rests, places to take a breath, to stop, restart, and so on. If you have a copy of the Graduale Romanum, I'm using the triplex version, which has the old notation as well as the current notation, but it's the same music as the Graduale Romanum, the main book we use for chant at Mass. You will see that there was a rest in the middle of this line that we just sang, after fecísti. Now, I've told the brothers not to rest there. In my opinion, and this may square with some of the more recent scholarship on the question, We want to try to keep as close to the text as we can, and if we don't need to breathe at those quarter rests, it's better not to. Now we have enough singers here who are familiar with the style that it's easier for us to do. Why don't we sing it once with the break so you can hear what it sounds like. So take a breath this time. Notas, mihi, fecísti, Now, that's quite plausible. I think it sounds pretty good. To me, it's a little less energetic, but we stay together and we can breathe enough. We don't want to be holding our breath and be anxious about running out of breath and so on. So we try to stagger our breathing when we sing through that rest. Now, one of the things to make singing through the rest sound more musically coherent, one of the things we need to do is to connect these two phrases in some respectable way. And what we are doing is accenting the second syllable of fecísti, but in a particular way. We accent the last note of that syllable so that the switch between that syllable and the following syllable, you hear the difference between the accented syllable and unaccented. So for instance, we would say fecísti. And this again is different from what the solemn style of the 1950s would have told you to do, in which case you would accent the first note of a group. You'd say fecísti, fecísti, rather than what we're doing, fecísti. In my opinion, with this kind of different accent, it makes it easier to pronounce the text, and it makes it easier to knit the text together. So we're going to sing just the first line again so you can hear how we do this, and then I'll say something very brief about the second half before we stop. Notas, mihi, fecísti, second half, which we're going to do for you, there is also another quarter rest between adimplébis and laetítia. We were practicing this right before we recorded, and we realized you could, again, in terms of the sense of the phrase, pause before laetítia. You will be singing, "You will fill me with joy." And that's not an impossible way to say it. But again, I think it's a little more interesting to press through. But to do this, you have to be ready to go kind of fast. You know, it doesn't work to realize only when you get there that the conductor said, "Oh wait, I'm not supposed to breathe here. Otherwise it won't sound very musical." So listen how we do this very quickly between adimplébis and laetítia, and then we'll finish up with a broader ending indicating God's presence. So, the second half of the chant Notas, mihi, fecísti.